something strange happened after you woke up. The hobbies that used to bring you joy, the activities you'd spend hours on, the interests that defined you, suddenly feel empty, meaningless. You try to engage with them and feel nothing, like you're going through motions that used to matter but don't anymore. You thought awakening would make life more vibrant, more alive, more engaging. Instead, you've lost interest in almost everything that used to excite you. And you're wondering, did I break something in myself? Am I depressed? What's wrong with me? Carl Jung would say, nothing is wrong with you. You're experiencing what he called the death of the persona's interests. When your consciousness expands beyond ego-level concerns, everything that served the ego becomes irrelevant. Your hobbies didn't lose their value. You outgrew the consciousness level they were designed to satisfy. I'm about to explain why awakening kills your old interests, what's actually happening psychologically, and what comes after this uncomfortable void. If you've lost interest in everything you used to love, Jung would say you're not broken. You're between paradigms. And what's coming is worth the loss of what's dying. Here's what Jung understood that explains everything. Most hobbies exist to serve the ego or escape the unconscious. They're either building your persona, distracting you from your shadow, or keeping you from existential questions you're not ready to face. Before awakening, these functions feel like genuine interest. After awakening, you see through them. Think about what your hobbies actually did before you awakened. They gave you identity. I'm a gamer, a runner, a reader, an artist. They provided escape from uncomfortable feelings. They filled time so you didn't have to sit with yourself. They created achievement to validate your ego. They offered community where you could belong, without depth. None of this was conscious. You genuinely loved these activities. They brought real joy, real engagement, real meaning. But that meaning was serving a consciousness level you've now transcended. And once you outgrow the level an activity serves, the activity loses its pull. Jung experienced this profoundly after his individuation. Activities he'd enjoyed for years, certain social engagements, academic pursuits, conventional success markers, suddenly felt hollow. Not because they became less valuable objectively, but because his consciousness had expanded beyond the needs they were meeting. This is what's happening to you. Your hobbies aren't boring now because they changed. You changed. Your consciousness evolved to a level where activities designed for ego satisfaction no longer satisfy. And you're stuck in the uncomfortable gap between losing the old interests and discovering what actually engages your awakened consciousness. Jung's first insight into why hobbies die after awakening. Most of what you called interests were actually ego identity construction. You weren't doing the hobby for its own sake. You were doing it to maintain a sense of who you are. And once you individuate beyond ego identity, those activities lose their purpose. Before awakening, your hobbies answered the question, who am I? Without you realizing that's what they were doing. I'm a musician. I'm a gamer. I'm a fitness person. I'm a reader. The activity itself was less important than the identity it provided. It gave you something to say when people asked about you. It gave you a tribe to belong to. It gave you a sense of self. But awakening dismantles ego identity. You stop deriving your sense of self from external activities and roles. You find yourself, capital S, that essential nature beneath all the constructed identities. And once you've found that, you don't need hobbies to tell you who you are anymore. One of Jung's patients, a man who'd been an avid rock climber for 15 years, described what happened after his awakening. I used to climb every weekend. It was my identity. I was a climber. Then after my awakening, I went to the climbing gym and felt nothing. It wasn't that climbing became less interesting. It's that I didn't need it to tell me who I was anymore. I'd spent years constructing this climber identity, and my individuation dissolved it. Now I was just me. Not a climber, just my actual self. And the hobby that had served that identity construction felt pointless. He hadn't become lazy or depressed. His consciousness had simply evolved beyond needing external identity props. The hobby served ego construction, and his ego was no longer his primary identity structure. So, the hobby died. This is what's happening when your interests vanish after awakening. You're discovering that many of your hobbies weren't genuine soul interests. They were ego identity maintenance. You were a photographer more than you were someone who loved photography for its own sake. You were a runner more than someone who loved running itself. You were whatever identity the hobby provided. And now that you don't need those identities, the activities feel hollow. You try to engage and wonder, why am I doing this? Because you were never doing it for the activity itself. You were doing it for the identity it gave you. Once that need dissolves, the motivation dies with it. Jung called this the crisis of the dissolved persona. You've lost the identities that organized your life, but you haven't yet discovered what your authentic self actually wants to do. You're in the void between false interests and real ones. And it's deeply uncomfortable because our culture teaches us to always be interested in something, always be productive, always be engaged. But you're not interested because you're not playing the identity game anymore. Jung's second insight. Most hobbies functioned as sophisticated escape mechanisms from uncomfortable internal states. You weren't doing the activity to engage with life. You were doing it to avoid feelings, thoughts, or existential questions you weren't ready to face. And once you awaken and can sit with your internal reality, the need to escape disappears. Before awakening, your hobbies served a crucial psychological function. They kept you distracted. They filled the space where anxiety might arise. They occupied your mind so you didn't have to face existential questions. They created flow states that bypassed uncomfortable emotions. They were buffers between you and your unconscious material. Gaming for hours wasn't just entertainment, it was numbing. Scrolling social media wasn't just connection, it was avoidance. Binge-watching shows wasn't just relaxation, it was escape from yourself. Even productive hobbies like fitness or learning languages often served the same function, keeping you too busy to feel what you were avoiding. Jung noticed this pattern constantly. Patients would describe losing interest in activities they'd spent years on, and through analysis would discover the activity had been a defense mechanism against unconscious material. Once they integrated that material through therapeutic work, the need for the defense disappeared, and with it, the interest in the activity. One woman who'd been obsessed with home renovation projects described her experience. I'd spend every spare moment planning renovations, watching design shows, shopping for furniture. After my awakening, I lost all interest. Through reflection, I realized those projects were keeping me from feeling the emptiness in my marriage. As long as I was fixing my house, I didn't have to face what was broken in my relationship. Once I awakened and could sit with that uncomfortable truth, I didn't need the renovation obsession anymore. It wasn't that interior design became boring, it's that I didn't need it to distract me from my pain. This is the uncomfortable truth about many hobbies. They're not genuine interests, they're unconscious coping mechanisms. And awakening removes the need for those coping mechanisms because you can now face directly what you were avoiding. You can sit with anxiety instead of gaming it away. You can feel loneliness instead of scrolling it away. You can face existential questions instead of staying busy enough to avoid them. You can be with yourself, all of yourself, including the uncomfortable parts, without needing external activities to buffer the experience. So, your hobbies die. Not because you've become depressed or lost your zest for life, but because you no longer need escape mechanisms. You've developed the capacity to be present with reality, including uncomfortable reality. And activities whose primary function was escape lose their appeal when you're no longer running. But here's what makes this phase so disorienting. You don't yet know what you actually enjoy versus what served as escape. You're discovering that most of what you thought were genuine interests were actually sophisticated avoidance strategies. And now you're left wondering, what do I actually like? What activities do I choose from authentic desire versus unconscious need to escape? That's the question you're learning to answer. And it requires sitting in the uncomfortable void of not knowing, not filling it with activities just to avoid the discomfort. This void is where your real interests emerge, but only if you can tolerate the emptiness long enough for something authentic to arise. Jung's third insight reveals why even good hobbies feel meaningless after awakening. Your consciousness has developed depth perception, and surface activities no longer satisfy. You need engagement that matches your consciousness level, and most hobbies are designed for surface-level awareness. Before awakening, you could engage with activities at face value. Playing a game was just playing a game. Reading a book was just reading a book. Painting was just painting. Your consciousness was operating at the surface level the activity was designed for, so the engagement felt full and satisfying. But awakening develops multidimensional awareness. You start perceiving layers simultaneously: surface, subtext, psychological undercurrents, symbolic meaning, archetypal patterns. When you try to engage with hobbies designed for single-layer awareness, your consciousness feels cramped, like trying to express three-dimensional experience through two-dimensional medium. One man, a lifelong video game enthusiast, described what happened after his awakening. "I'd loved complex strategy games for 20 years. After awakening, I tried playing and felt suffocated. Not because the game was bad, but because my consciousness was perceiving on so many levels that the game's single-layer engagement felt reductive. I was aware of the game mechanics, the psychological manipulation in the reward systems, the way it was designed to trigger dopamine, the hours I was spending in a constructed reality while my actual life waited, all simultaneously. I couldn't just play anymore. My consciousness wouldn't let me engage at only the surface level the game required." He wasn't being too intellectual or overthinking. His consciousness had genuinely developed beyond what the activity could hold. The game required single-layer engagement to be enjoyable, but he was perceiving in multi-dimensions. The mismatch made the activity feel hollow. This is why awakened people often struggle with entertainment, hobbies, and leisure activities. Not because they're snobs or can't have fun, but because their consciousness needs engagement that matches its complexity. A movie that most people enjoy feels shallow because you're perceiving the psychological dynamics, the cultural conditioning, the archetypal story structure. You can't just watch it. Your consciousness won't let you engage at only the level the movie requires. Jung found this same challenge. After his individuation, he couldn't enjoy activities that required him to operate at consciousness levels he'd transcended. Reading popular fiction felt suffocating because he perceived too many layers. Social gatherings felt hollow because he was aware of all the unconscious dynamics playing out. Even academic conferences sometimes felt reductive because they operated at only intellectual level when his consciousness perceived emotional, spiritual, and archetypal dimensions simultaneously. This doesn't mean awakened people can't enjoy anything. It means they need activities that can hold multidimensional engagement. Reading mythology or depth psychology satisfies because these fields honor multiple layers. Creating art can work because you can pour multidimensional awareness into it. Deep conversation with conscious people satisfies because it can span multiple dimensions. Nature often works because it contains infinite layers to perceive. But conventional hobbies, designed for surface engagement, single-layer awareness, and ego satisfaction, feel like psychological suffocation. Not because something's wrong with the hobbies or with you, but because there's a fundamental mismatch between your consciousness level and the awareness level the activity requires. This is why you're losing interest in things you used to love. Your consciousness evolved, the activities didn't. And you can't force yourself back into surface-level engagement just to maintain your hobbies. Your consciousness has developed past the point where that's possible. If you're recognizing this, your hobbies died because they were ego identity props, escape mechanisms, or required surface-level engagement your consciousness has transcended. You're not broken. You're between what served your old consciousness and what will serve your awakened self. This void is uncomfortable, but it's necessary. Before we explore what comes after this death of interests, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery. Let's continue because these next insights explain what you're actually hungry for and why nothing satisfies that hunger yet. Jung's fourth insight explains the restlessness you feel. After awakening, you're no longer seeking entertainment or distraction. You're seeking meaning. And most hobbies are designed to entertain, not to generate meaning. That's why nothing satisfies anymore. Before awakening, hobbies satisfied because they provided pleasure, achievement, distraction, or social connection. These were enough. Your consciousness was operating at a level where entertainment could fulfill you, where achievements could satisfy you, where pleasant experiences felt meaningful. But awakening shifts your hierarchy of needs completely. Jung discovered that once someone individuates, they develop what he called the need for meaning, a psychological hunger that can only be satisfied by activities that generate genuine meaning, not just pleasure or achievement. Entertainment stops working because it's designed for pleasure, not meaning. Achievement stops satisfying because it serves ego, not self. Social hobbies feel hollow because they offer belonging without depth. You're not seeking what hobbies traditionally provide anymore. You're seeking what Jung called participation in the meaningful life, activities that connect you to something larger than ego satisfaction. One woman described her experience. After awakening, I couldn't watch TV anymore. I'd try, and within minutes felt this desperate restlessness. Not boredom, hunger. I was hungry for meaning, and television was offering empty calories. I'd pick up my phone, put it down, start a game, close it. Nothing satisfied because I wasn't seeking entertainment anymore. I was seeking engagement with something real, something meaningful, something that mattered beyond just passing time pleasantly. She wasn't being difficult or joyless. Her consciousness had evolved to the point where meaning became the primary need, and activities that didn't generate meaning no longer satisfied that need. It's like being hungry for protein and trying to satisfy it with sugar. You can consume all you want, but the hunger remains because you're feeding the wrong need. Jung experienced this intensely. After his individuation, he couldn't engage in activities just for entertainment or achievement. He needed work that felt meaningful, relationships that held depth, activities that connected him to something essential. Anything less felt like starvation, regardless of how pleasant or successful it was. This is why you've lost interest in your hobbies. They're not generating the meaning your awakened consciousness needs. They might still be enjoyable at a surface level, but they don't feed the hunger you have now. And trying to force yourself to maintain them feels like trying to survive on empty calories when you're starving for nutrients. But here's the challenge. Meaning can't be pursued directly. You can't decide, I'll do meaningful things now, and have that work. Meaning emerges from authentic engagement with what your self, not your ego, is genuinely drawn toward. And discovering what that is requires sitting in the void of not knowing long enough for authentic interest to arise. This is the uncomfortable phase you're in. Your old interests are dead because they don't generate meaning, but your new interests haven't fully emerged yet because you're still learning to discern ego desires from self-desires, surface pleasure from deep satisfaction, entertainment from meaningful engagement. Jung's final insight offers hope. The death of your old interests isn't permanent emptiness. It's the necessary void where your authentic interests can finally emerge. But they can only emerge if you stop trying to fill the void with activities just to avoid the discomfort of having no interests. Most people panic when their hobbies die. They frantically try new activities, force themselves to maintain old ones, or conclude something's wrong with them. But Jung discovered, this void is sacred. It's the gap between false interests and real ones. And if you can sit in it without filling it artificially, something authentic will emerge. Your old interests served your ego and your unconscious defenses. They had to die so something real could be born. But what's real can't emerge while you're clinging to what's false or desperately filling the space with new activities that serve the same old functions. One man described his experience of this void. For 6 months after my awakening, I had 0 interests. Everything I used to love felt dead. I panicked and tried forcing myself to engage with my old hobbies, but it felt like psychological violence. Finally, I just surrendered to having no interests. I'd sit in the evenings with nothing to do, feeling the discomfort, the restlessness, the fear that I'd never be interested in anything again. Then, slowly, something started emerging. Not a hobby, but a pull. I found myself wanting to write, not for achievement or identity, but because something in me needed to be expressed. It wasn't like my old interests. It was quieter, deeper, more essential. He discovered that his authentic interests were nothing like his ego interests. They didn't provide identity or escape. They emerged from a deeper place, from self rather than ego. But they could only emerge after he stopped trying to fill the void with substitutes. Jung found this same pattern. After the death of his professional persona and conventional interests, he spent time in profound emptiness. But from that void emerged his real work, active imagination, his exploration of the collective unconscious, his writing. These weren't hobbies in the conventional sense. They were expressions of his essential nature that could only emerge once the false interests died. This is what's available to you, not a return to your old interests or a frantic search for new ones, but the emergence of something authentic. But it requires patience. It requires sitting in the uncomfortable void. It requires trusting that having no interests right now doesn't mean you'll never be interested in anything again. It means you're in the fertile emptiness where real interests are germinating. Your authentic interests might look nothing like your old hobbies. They might not provide identity, achievement, or escape. They might not be productive or impressive. They might be quiet, simple, or seemingly insignificant. But they'll come from yourself, not your ego. And that makes all the difference. The question isn't, what should I be interested in? It's, what is myself genuinely drawn toward once ego needs are removed? And you can only answer that question by sitting in the void long enough for the answer to emerge organically. Let me bring this together. Your hobbies died because they were serving ego identity, functioning as escape mechanisms, or requiring surface-level engagement your consciousness transcended. You're not broken, you're between paradigms. Your old interests served a consciousness level you've outgrown. Your new interests haven't fully emerged yet because you're learning to discern ego desires from self-desires. This death of interests is actually initiation. Jung would say, you're in the sacred void where authentic engagement becomes possible, but only if you stop trying to fill the void artificially. Only if you can tolerate the discomfort of having no hobbies, no interests, no activities that satisfy. Your old hobbies had to die. They were built on false identity, unconscious avoidance, and surface engagement. They served you well at one consciousness level, but you've evolved past that level. Trying to maintain them now would be trying to fit awakened consciousness into ego-sized containers. It doesn't work. It creates suffering. But the void isn't permanent. Something real is emerging. Something that comes from your essential nature rather than ego construction. Something that generates meaning rather than just providing entertainment. Something that engages your whole consciousness rather than requiring you to dim your awareness to participate. You can't force it or rush it. You can only create conditions for its emergence by sitting in the emptiness without filling it with substitutes. By being willing to have no interest until real interest arises. By trusting that yourself knows what it's genuinely drawn toward, even when your ego has no idea. If you've lost interest in your hobbies after awakening, Jung would tell you, this isn't depression or apathy. It's transformation. Your consciousness evolved beyond the activities that served your ego, and now you're in the gap between false interests and authentic ones. Stop trying to force yourself back into hobbies that feel dead. They're dead for a reason. Stop frantically searching for new activities to fill the void. The void is where your real interests are germinating. Stop believing something's wrong with you because you're not interested in anything. You're not interested in anything false anymore. That's growth, not pathology. Sit in the discomfort of having no hobbies. Feel the restlessness, the boredom, the fear that you'll never be interested in anything again. But don't fill that space artificially. Don't force engagement with activities just to avoid the emptiness. The emptiness is sacred. It's the pregnant void where something authentic can finally be born. Your authentic interests will emerge when you're ready. They'll come from yourself, not your ego. They'll generate meaning, not just provide distraction. They'll engage your awakened consciousness, not require you to dim your awareness. But they can only emerge in the space created by the death of what was false. Trust the void. Trust the process. Trust that having no interests right now is preparing you for engagement with what's real. If you're navigating the death of your old interests and the uncomfortable void that follows awakening, subscribe to this channel. To dive even deeper into Jung's revolutionary psychology and what it means for your spiritual awakening, click the recommended video on your screen now.